One of the major problems that we faced regularly with our clients, especially with new clients, is when the sponsor has been in control of a new building, new construction building, or a conversion, and after having control of that, it's time now to turn it over to the independent residents of the building who are now going to be sitting as the first time for board, and they come to us and say, what are we supposed to do? What are we supposed to look for? Help us out. Where would we go from here? In doing that, we come and say, okay, this is starting your education. It's Condo Co-ops 101, and we need to look at the basics and see what your obligations are as a board, what are your job tasks, and what type of team are you going to put together to get you through those things. Usually those things involve getting management, independent managing agent, getting an accountant on board, and of course having us hired as their attorney to represent them and sort of give them the roadmap and also the rules of engagement. And in facing that, we find that there are many levels of problems, some of which are built into the system and the bylaws and the structure, and others of which are based into the economics of control and what's been happening and what's the status of the building and what problems they face.
And sometimes the problems will relate. Sometimes the problems may be construction related, particularly in newly constructed buildings or renovated buildings. And those problems are likewise connected to financial issues as to whether a budget was properly set up, whether the corporation or the condominium association is operating at a break-even level, or payables are amounting, and there are inadequate reserves or resources to make necessary repairs.
And we've had many situations where the first thing we have to do is try and find out where you're at. What are your systems? Are they operating? We bring in an engineer to look at the building and say, okay, in the plan it says this is what you're supposed to get, and we then have to try and determine, did you get what you were promised, and if even it's what's promised, what condition is it in? Was there defective construction even though they gave you the type of boiler they said it was going to be? Is it working, and was it adequate for the system that was supposed to be built? The same thing happens with, we had with, for example, in those windows in that one building where you can tell the windows are sort of pressed out.
Where the windows were failing on a regular basis, and because windows were being repaired under sponsor control, other unit owners were unaware, and purchasers were unaware of the issue. The problem that we often find is that newly elected boards sit and discuss these issues among themselves, or even with their unit owners, who are also frustrated, and it is for a fairly prolonged period of time before they realize this is above what they can handle on their own, and at that time very valuable time has gone by. So what we suggest to our boards, newly elected boards, is they have to act promptly. And acting promptly means making a determination as to what the issues are or are not. And that often requires the help of management, an accountant, a law firm, and an engineering or architectural firm, so you can at least assess what the issues are, what's before you, and what rights you have, and also enable you to exercise your rights in a timely fashion. You want to discuss some of the time limitations.
Yeah, the bigger problem that we find in many cases is that by the time the board gets control, tries to figure out what they're supposed to be doing, time periods could be running, because under many of the statutes, if it's a smaller building, you have warranties that are written into the law by state, but most of the time they're exempt from those because they're over 5 stories. But there are some things written into the offering plans. The offering plan is where everything starts. It has the rules of the condo or co-op and their basic documents such as the declaration and bylaws for condominium, or the proprietaries and bylaws for a co-op. And in addition to those things, they have the representations that the sponsor has to make by law. And many of the times, they will then have periods of time to have to, what we call statute of limitations, to make a complaint. So for example, there could be 1 year for the board, whoever the board is,
or for unit owners,
right, to make a complaint about the common elements. Or there could be a problem with your individual unit, which will have a 6-month limitation from the time you closed. Well, one of the problems, if you have a board who has to make complaints and the sponsor still has control, it would be in the position where the sponsor is complaining about himself, and they're not going to take the usual steps that you need. So one of the problems is trying to find a way to make sure that those time periods haven't run by the time the board gets in place to investigate and monitor and see what they got and timely make those types of complaints.
Another issue that boards should be aware of is that it's much easier sometimes to resolve these issues, and sometimes with the assistance of the Attorney General's office, if the sponsor still retains ownership of a number of units. Once the sponsor is sold out of a building, bringing the sponsor back in becomes a very difficult task. In addition, sometimes those units that the sponsor retains are retained in a different ownership name, further making it more difficult for the Attorney General or even for the condominium association itself to go after assets of the sponsor who may be obligated in some way to the association.
And one of the other issues is the issue of the finances, figuring out what your budgets are, what your expenses should be, so you know whether or not you're going to be running at a deficit or whether the sponsor artificially kept the estimates low to make sure that the things look good on sales. And you got to get good management to come in and look at what your real budgets are, get your accountant in, and then you can go to the next step of working with your UNOs. And educating your UNOs of not having false expectations is another job that the board has to do.
So the snapshot summary is you have to assess what your circumstances are, both with your physical plant, with your finances, and you have to bring in professionals who will be able to assist you to recognize those issues so you can better diagnose what is at hand and the best way to resolve it.